It was late July when I was hanging out with my friend and a couple of our other friends at his house for the night. We were having a campfire in his backyard, drinking some beer. My friend has a 2-year-old golden retriever named Steve, who just so happens to share the name of his owner, Steve. Anyway, Steve, the dog, was hanging out with us as we sat around and talked. Steve always likes playing fetch, so I was throwing his frisbee across the ridiculously big backyard. The grass extended back about 75 yards, where there was a strip of woods in between the houses on the other street. So, as I was playing fetch with Steve, he started barking like crazy in the direction of the house behind the woods. He wouldn't listen to us, but rather stood there, growling, snarling, and barking at seemingly nothing. After a couple of minutes, Steve came back to us with his frisbee like normal, almost like he completely forgot about what he was barking at in the first place. It was definitely out of character for him, given that we'd never heard him bark once in our lives. We sort of forgot about it, going back to talking about whatever it was we were talking about before. A few minutes later, Steve, the owner, stopped what he was saying in the middle of his sentence and stared towards the woods. We all turned back and looked in confusion, but I found nothing out of the ordinary. That's when Steve told us that the house behind his was abandoned. That got me thinking. There was a faint, yellow light shining through the window of the first floor that was definitely not on previously. He went on to explain that the house was recently damaged in a fire, and the family moved out afterward. We were spooked, but definitely interested, and since there were 4 of us, we decided to finish off our beers and check it out. We're pretty big guys, and could definitely fend for ourselves, but Steve brought his BB gun just in case, so we made our way through the woods to the backyard of the house. As we walked closer to the back door, I noticed that the house had an in-ground pool. The water looked dark green and muggy, definitely giving off the impression that no one lived there. We quietly tried the back door, but it was locked. We made our way around to the front of the house, checking to make sure there weren't any neighbors watching, then tried the door handle on the front door. It was unlocked. Steve stepped inside first, pointing his BB gun, as we closely followed behind. The first impression I got of the inside was creepy to say the least. Many of the walls were black after being burnt by the fire. A couple of the windows were shattered, either from the fire itself or intruders. But again, we were also technically intruders. Parts of the floor were burnt to a crisp, so we had to be extra cautious of where we were stepping. There was no furniture in what seemed to be the living room area, but everything was still faintly illuminated from the light in the other room. As soon as I stepped in the room with the light, I could now make out that it was the kitchen. The source of the light was coming from a flashlight, but it was sitting inside of the sink. It was definitely weird, but that wasn't what freaked me out the most. The window was in perfect view of Steve's backyard, so whoever put that flashlight there definitely would have been able to see us sitting around the fire. It was almost like they purposely left the flashlight, knowing we'd be able to see. That's when Steve had a brilliant idea of checking out the basement, which was definitely not what I wanted to do, especially after just coming to that realization. He opened the burnt basement door, and I pulled out my iPhone flashlight to see what was down there. Everything was completely burnt to a crisp, and the stairs were definitely not functional. It doesn't take a fireman to know that the source of the fire started in the basement. Relieved, I closed the door and followed Steve as we all walked up the seemingly undamaged stairs to the upper level of the house. At the top, everything was in perfect condition, so the fire must have been put out before it reached the second floor. I started to realize that the decrepit house was once a really nice home to a family. There were 5 rooms upstairs, and it actually had a similar layout to Steve's. As we checked the first room, everything was totally quiet, until we heard something that caught us off guard. There was music coming from one of the other rooms. It wasn't loud at all, but definitely loud enough for us to all hear. Steve stormed out of the room as the rest of us followed, as we tried to narrow down the source of the sound. It was coming from the last hallway on the left, but the door was closed. Steve opened it anyway, yelling, "Who's there?" pointing his BB gun. But after scanning the room, nothing was there, except for a Bluetooth speaker, sitting on the floor in the middle of the room. The one spot we hadn't checked was the closet. Certain that we'd find someone inside, we started yelling for the person to come out. However, the door never moved, so that was our cue to open it up ourselves. As the door ripped open, I was shocked to find out that it was completely empty. The build-up to opening that door was enough to freak us out, so we made our way for the stairs to leave. As soon as we got out of the house, we looked at each other in disbelief as we made our way around towards the backyard to go home. I kept looking behind us, seeing the flashlight light up the kitchen through the window. I turned back around, confused and definitely a little creeped out. That's when my other friend turned to us. "Dude, someone's looking out the window on the second floor." I turned, completely shocked that he wasn't just messing with us. There was a silhouette of a person staring at us, in the same room we found the speaker. Steve suggested we should go back, but none of us were up for that, so we continued through the woods back to his house. It almost felt like whoever was inside that house purposely lured us out there. They had a clear view of us the whole time, and definitely would have saw us coming in the first place. I'm not sure why the person hid from us. Maybe it was just to scare us, or maybe they didn't expect there to be 4 of us. Our only guess is that the person hid in the attic when they saw us coming, since we had pretty much checked everywhere except for the attic. But again, that's just speculation. I'm not sure if anything would have turned out different if there had only been 2 of us, but I'm glad I'll never have to find out. When I was a kid, I grew up by a pretty popular amusement park called Geauga Lake in Aurora, Ohio. My family would always take me there, and we always had a great time. Even when I got into high school, my friends and I would often go up there to hang out on the weekends. Unfortunately, once other amusement parks like Cedar Point and Kings Island opened, they forced Geauga Lake out of business. What once stood as a life-filled amusement park was now a creepy, untouched ghost town. 2 of my friends and I still lived in the area, so we decided to get together and check it out. We got there around 10 p.m., since we'd be less likely to get caught in the dark. After crawling through a fence that was already cut out by other people to get in, we made our way around to the entrance area of the park where we'd be more familiar. Once we reached that point, we stopped and took everything in, reminiscing the good old days. It was sad to see the place so dead and lifeless, but at the same time, it was also a little creepy. Tall grass had grown through several parts of the park, windows were shattered, buildings were covered in graffiti, and saddest of all, our favorite spot that we hung out in under a huge tree had fallen down. Nonetheless, we were happy to be back at the place that we spent so much time in as kids. We tried a few doors to some of the old buildings, but most were locked, and we didn't feel like crawling through the glass and the broken windows to get inside. As we kept exploring, we found our favorite restaurant, which just so happened to be unlocked. Once we got in, I was sad to see the overall deterioration of the restaurant we once spent so much time in, but it felt good to be back to see it one last time. After hanging out in the one booth that wasn't completely destroyed, we ventured to check out the old rides. Some of them were already demolished, but the few that remained were in terrible condition, dark, and ominous looking. They were rusted and overgrown with vines, and the old concession stands were falling apart. We started making our way back to the front, and decided to stop into the restaurant one last time. As I was looking out the window, I realized that the old building across from us was an old ice cream shop, so I went over to see if it was unlocked, since it wasn't one of the buildings we checked. When I turned the door handle, it fell off the door, but somebody had broken the lock, so it opened right up. Surprised, I ran back across to the restaurant and told my friends that we could go inside. They were checking out the kitchen area and said they'd go look at it in a few minutes. I made my way back to the booth, remembering all the times I stood in front of the building with my parents to get ice cream as a kid. Anyway, I guess I sort of zoned out in thought and blankly stared at the table in front of me. Suddenly, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. Somebody was standing in the window of the ice cream shop, staring at me. It took me a second to adjust my eyes, but I realized that it was someone dressed up in a panda costume. He was just standing there, obviously not expecting anyone else to be here, especially someone in a costume. I was freaked out. I got up and ran back into the kitchen where my friends were, and told them to look out the window. When I first told them, they didn't believe me, until they saw it for themselves. "Guys, isn't that one of the old mascots?" I looked at my friend as he said that, and I completely realized what he was talking about. Geauga Lake had 4 mascots, a monkey, a lion, a dog, and a panda. They would always be at the front of the park greeting people as they'd walk in. As the 3 of us stared back at this panda, it started waving at us. That was enough for us to get the hell out of there. We tried to act normal as we started walking back to the entrance, where we'd still have to find where we came in. As soon as we reached the front area of the entrance, I turned back around, and there it was, standing in the middle of the walkway in between the buildings. That's when I started running, and my friends followed suit when they realized why. We eventually found the hole in the fence, where we continued running to the car. Once we were maybe halfway in the grass field to the car, I turned around one last time, and it was there, standing behind the fence, waving at us. Now, as to why someone would be alone, wearing a panda costume, standing in an abandoned amusement park in the middle of the night is beyond my comprehension. We haven't been back since, and especially after that, we're not planning on it. When I was in high school, I was really into photography. My dream was to get hired as a photojournalist by a major media company, so I was up to doing just about anything to get some good pictures. One night, I went to an abandoned psych ward to grab a few nighttime pictures from there. The place had been closed down for about 3 years, but after talking to my friend who'd already explored there, he offered to go with me. I met him at his house, and he drove us there. The old psych ward was scheduled to be demolished within the next month, so I wanted to capture some memories of the building that was once inhabited by so many people before it became a pile of debris. The building was notorious for being haunted, but neither myself or my friend really believed in the paranormal. When we arrived, we parked the car in front of the house that was a couple blocks down from the building to avoid being spotted when the police did their nighttime patrols. My friend led the way, and I followed behind, very excited, but also a little nervous. As we walked along the fence towards the building, I noticed that the building definitely had an eerie vibe to it. It was a giant mass of darkness standing in the middle of the night, and no one but ourselves knew where we were. Once we reached a certain point, my friend and I hopped the fence and began walking across the grass to the emergency side door entrance that was supposedly unlocked. I really didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, but as soon as the creaky door swung open, I was blasted with damp and musty air as we walked inside. It reeked of urine and bleach, and it stung our nostrils. We flipped on our flashlights and began walking down the long and dark hallway. The building was not in great shape by any means, with holes all over the walls and floors, in addition to the hanging wires from the ceiling. I took a few pictures of the first floor wing and a couple of the other rooms, and even found some old drawings from what I assumed to be the patients from the psych ward. It was definitely a really creepy place, but we were having a great time. We even found the old elevator that was totally destroyed on the inside, but it made for some great shots. Shortly after, we found the stairwell that would lead to the basement, and although hesitant, we went down. Now, I really wasn't scared on the first floor, but the basement was really creepy. Everything was pitch black, and it seemed like our flashlights weren't even able to illuminate more than a few feet ahead of us. As we slowly made our way down one side of the hallway, we found a room that was labeled Boiler Room. I tried the door handle, and after a little pushing, I got it to open. Inside were ancient-looking mechanical machines that I'd never seen before. There were also several boxes along the wall of what looked to be old electrical equipment, but the wires were all ripped apart and hanging. After a couple pictures, we made our way down to the next room, labeled Storage. Inside were old hospital beds with leather straps coming out of the sides of the cart. It was exactly what I imagined. Some of the straps had teeth marks in them, and parts of the cart were badly scratched or broken, making me wonder what really happened to it. It was a pretty chilling sight, until we were interrupted by a loud crash from somewhere in the basement. We both froze, trying to hone in on where the sound came from, but it was impossible to tell from the empty hallways that echoed with the sound of anything. My friend walked out of the room with his flashlight and yelled, "Hello?" I tensed up as we waited for a response, wishing he hadn't said anything in the first place. That's when I really started to get scared, so I ran out into the hallway next to him and told him I wanted to leave. He wasn't opposed, because unless something huge just randomly fell on its own, we weren't alone. Then, out of nowhere, we heard another noise again. This time, it sounded like a bunch of metal tools had been knocked over, and we were able to tell which end of the hallway it came from, and we pointed our flashlights down the hallway. With the darkness engulfing the beam of the light, it wasn't much help. Suddenly, I was able to hear footsteps around the other end of the building, and unless it was my imagination, it sounded like they were getting closer. Without much time to stand around, we made our way up the stairs to the first floor. As soon as we started heading towards the exit at the end of the hallway, I heard a loud growling sound coming directly below us. I don't know how to put it, but it sounded like a loud grunt of frustration. We eventually got back to his car, and with our hearts pounding, we were speechless. I don't know who was down there that night, and I'm glad I never found out. I was relieved to get home, but that all changed when I woke up the next morning. As I was just about to walk out the door, I walked past my dad and said bye as he was watching the news. When I looked at the TV, I completely froze in my steps. The headline of the news was that the old psych ward was burned down last night, just hours after we left. Obviously not wanting to tell my dad I was just there, I walked out of the door and left for school, in total disbelief. Although I got some great pictures that night, it still deeply disturbs me that someone was down there with us the entire time, and we were oblivious to it all. It could be a crazy coincidence, but deep down, I know it wasn't.